I scuffed back with Scotch Brite, which scratched up a bit of the decal which was undesirable, but I didn't care so much knowing that it was an area that was going to be covered up by the pickguard. It's the edge around the top and the tail on the front of the guitar where I was more concerned about the graphic getting scuffed up or damaged in any way, because there was nothing protecting it at this point. In a way, you could say that I didn't have to glue down any part of the decal where the pickguard would be, but I didn't realise at the time that this would be covered up by the pickguard anyway. I cut out a mask of the main decal design from the cutoff of the second print of the pickguard. This is a mask from Photoshop Theory, cut out to the exact shape of the image below that you want to protect. Where the gun that you see is right now, I can hit all of that because it's just the mask that is being hit and the paint falls exactly where I want it, right up to the edge of the gun, for example. I airbrushed this whole area to blend the colour that I switched to and match the colour of the guitar body. On the top edge of the horn you can see a little bit of fuzziness. That is a bit of paper coming through the paint. Once the paint is dry, it can be sanded back and painted over once again to smooth it out. So the theory again is adding the paint to the edge excessively, mainly on the exposed white paper areas, was to make it stiff and solidified so that it could be sanded back smooth, and that worked well on the earlier rounds of this process. At this point, the curve of the edge of the guitar is coming up nicely to meet the front of the decal. Here at the tail of the guitar you can see that there is a little more damage to the decal. It was exposed a bit too soon and a lot of the sanding did not treat it well. Using the mask to control any overflow and becoming more confident in my airbrush skills, I was blending where the red edge had to fade up into the darker area of the decal around the pickup jack. All other areas were just red on red, but here a fade was required to avoid a hard red line in this area of transition. There was quite a lot of damage here on the tail near the Uma Thurman part of the decal. So going against the theory that paint is not a filler, I was again using the paint to fill in the area where there was an uneven section on the curve up to the decal. Here is a perfect example of sanding and filling again. Sanding back the furriness coming through from the paper edge and flooding the area again with paint from the airbrush. This was done for two reasons. One was so that you don't see the edge of the paper, and the second was to smooth over the natural curve of the guitar edge. Here I am using the mask a little more directly, moving it around to get the paint right up to where I needed it. Right there you can see that cutting line that I had caused when I was cutting the painter's tape to a line that I wanted on that round of painting. That was when I did the last can spray that you saw where the front was all taped off. So here was a bit of genius on my part, as I did not put the camera on the right side of the guitar. What you can't see on the other side of the guitar is that cutout masking off the exact line of the printout, allowing a heavier layer of paint to cover over the edge as a final smoothing of the edge and not letting any of the paint hit the design. This also let the overspray onto more of the front of the decal that was red and bring all the areas to the same shade of red. I might have wet sanded the back and the sides a little to make sure the paint was flat and remove any orange peel. Hitting the edge and the front with the can was effective enough that I did not have to add or remove any more paint on the front edge before adding the clear coat. In the end, for a first shot at an experimental idea, I think I pulled this project off quite nicely. There are only two little blemishes that I can still see in the finished product. One is just above the top of John Travolta's head, and the other is some dimpling around the tail edge near Uma's cigarette. That's the location where I mentioned that there was a little extra torn paper that I had to deal with. This was my very first polyurethane spraying. I only had confidence in what I was doing after watching many videos about using a spray gun. From painting a guitar, to woodwork, to car painting and clear coating. You can only really get good by jumping in and doing it yourself, but I had a lot of theory in the knowledge bank beforehand. It looks like I really didn't know what I was doing, but it all made sense after a while. The main aim was to cover the body and the front of the decal. After this would come more wet sanding before more clear coat, but this was definitely a fast learning experience. As with doing anything for the first time, I learnt a lot in this session. Though I was probably laying down too many layers at one time, I did get a little bit of run around the horns, but they were not too much of a big deal. I was continually changing the settings on the gun to reduce the amount of clear coat coming through to avoid laying down layers that were too thick in one pass. This is the second session of spraying polyurethane on after wet sanding. I'm hanging this body from wire. The wire goes up to a hook that I removed from a broken octopus lead or tie down, and that is hooked up to the loop on this birdcage stand that I am using to suspend from. The wire was fairly stiff, and I could use it to manipulate the angle of the guitar while I was spraying it. On this session, I got a little overconfident with how many layers I could shoot before I would encounter runs. Eventually, a torrent of runs formed on the left side where the tremolo spring cavity is on the back. On the front, I think there was one run in front of the larger Uma Thurman on the decal. But patience to let this coat cure completely, and wet sanding would deal with these problems. Here it is after 2 clear coat sessions and wet sanding. The shiny lines on the back of the guitar are the pits left by the massive runs that I mentioned. I was not keen to sand down to the valleys left by these runs. My patience with these projects was wearing thin at this point, so I did not lay another coat of clear coat, which from my new experiences would have cleared those sections up. I knew that polishing would make the areas around them shiny, and shiny on shiny equals perfection, right? So those imperfections in the flat sanding are not even visible unless you know to look for them. I was using the same drill attachment as when buffing the Squire Sunburst project, and this was the second time buffing a guitar. I added a small barrier around the body that would stop the loose wet compound splattering all over the room and onto anything in its path. I actually built this to make a pool or bath to soak my basketball ring in a mixture of vinegar and water to remove rust from it. I will continue to use it on further buffing projects because it helps a great deal in containing the off spray. I have a rubber mat down. It is the kind that you would put down on a guitar workbench to buffer the guitar from a hard work surface. I added some Chuck's rags and some junk mail pages so any spilt liquid compound would not soak into the rubber mat. There is the technique that I like to use in the cutaway. It is to hold the drill on a bit of an angle and just hit it with the edge of the buffing pad. As you saw, the body did not move much at all when I was trying to buff out the body cutaway. But in general, I have found that I have not had to nail the body down. In more recent projects, I have added one of those rubber non-slip work mats to stop it from moving around, and they work really well when performing this process. I also like to pre-dab the entire surface of the body so there is new compound to use when you move the pad into new areas. Once the compound is stuck to the bottom of the buffing pad, you can't be sure how much is coming back out to help with the process and how much is just being absorbed by the foam and not being applied to the surface. With only a couple of passes of the buffing pad, it comes up quite shiny and buffed looking. This was an oil-based poly because I was going over the top of solvent-based paint, and it was so much better than using a water-based polyurethane. I started the sides with a cylindrical buffing wheel. It was the one that I always imagined using for the sides of the bodies. The cone-shaped wheel I used on the Squire project was looking a little bit matted and tattered. This was a fresh new buffing wheel, so I chose this one for the majority of the work on this one. With just the few passes you see me do here, that is all I had to do to make the sides come up nice and shiny. Here I changed to the cone shape attachment to get into the tighter areas around the horns. As I mentioned in my buffing video, in future projects I would tape off the chuck of the drill, but at this point I think I was still living a little dangerously. After a long period of using this drill, it can feel so much heavier, and if you were to ever drop off the side of the body, the chuck would rip into the polyurethane and give you something you would have to deal with. So it came up all nice and shiny at the end of the buffing or actual polishing phase. Just like magic, after many hours of work, the edge of the decal is covered up and almost completely undetectable. I started thinking of doing a decal project after watching Will's Easy Guitar lay a cloth fabric with a flowery print onto the front of a guitar with an epoxy to hold it down. I didn't want to go so far as to put cloth on a guitar, so I got to thinking of what I would put on the front of a guitar. So to me, my favourite movie, and a movie that suits being on the front of a guitar, made sense. The whole element of cool in that movie and how cool guitars are made me think, yeah, it makes sense. It wouldn't make sense to put Milo and Otis on the front of a guitar, or Driving Miss Daisy, or Titanic. The logic is just not there. There is a bias towards Pulp Fiction for me, as it is easily my favourite movie. But it just made so much sense to put a Pulp Fiction graphic on the front of a guitar as a bit of memorabilia for a great movie. To keep the glue thin, I used a paint roller again to stick the graphic paper to the inside of the clear perspex. To line up with the nails in the screw holes, the guitar body is involved with thick black paper down to protect it from the glue. If I did this again, I would only dip a few discrete edges of the paper in the glue, or only the finest strip of glue around the outer edge, because I was banking on the glue going absolutely transparent and undetectable, but I did encounter many bubbles because of the paint roller. So looking back, I should have had a lot more glue and a process that would leave no air bubbles, or just a few tiny dabs to keep the paper in place, but almost non-existent. As you can see on the finished pickguard, the glue cleared 100%, but when you get up close you can see all the little air bubbles. I know this is just me being a perfectionist because from most angles they can't be seen, but they are there. And I know that they are there, so this is just an example of OCD kicking in. The pickups in the guitar are replaced with some Alnico 5 pickups from China. I actually purchased a preloaded pickguard for around $20 just to get the wiring harness and the pickups. I added a loop in the circuit to deal with the fact that there are only 2 pickups in a 5-way switch. Now that I think about it, I might just swap it out for a 3-way switch. The loop put the neck pickup also in the bridge position on the 5-way switching. So the switching now goes from 1 to 1 and 2 to 2 to ghost 1 and 2 to ghost 1. Again, like a ghost pickup. Basically, when you're switching toward the bridge pickup, it's actually switching back towards the neck pickup. No issue screwing down the pickguard because the holes were always marked out in the decal and often used with nails for keeping things lined up. This is the project that I really nailed from conception to completion. I thought I would share this project with the YouTube community because it was such a success and only the second guitar repaint or decal project I have ever done. I can wholeheartedly say that I have accomplished the idea that I had in the beginning and it was a complete success. Yay for me! Thank you for sticking around to see the end of this 2-part series. There is another series I put together for the creation of the Perspex pickguard. It was such an involved and lengthy process that I felt that it should be kept separated and presented as its own project. There will be a link displayed at the end of this video for it, or just go and check out my video list to find it. In these close-up pictures of the finished look, you should now be able to clearly see the bubbles in the glue that I have been talking about. Hopefully you would agree with me that they don't look so bad and that I should just stop talking about them. Thank you again for watching, and until next time, have a bloody good one.